This is a Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Emilio Sampedro, and in the early hours of Saturday, the 8th of December, these are our main stories. The governing Christian Democrats in Germany elect Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer as their new party leader, taking over from Angela Merkel, who remains as chancellor. President Trump has nominated a former journalist to be the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. And an enormous security operation gets underway in France ahead of anti-government protests. Also in this podcast,
if you're a bit suspicious, you're kind of disgusted about it, but somehow it's like Franco is back. You're trying to take him away and he's like, I'm here.
Why the proposed exhumation of General Francisco Franco is dividing Spain. The leader of Germany's biggest party, the CDU, has a good chance of becoming chancellor. And now Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer has won the vote to succeed Angela Merkel, who stood down after 18 years at the party's helm. At the party conference in Hamburg, Mrs. Merkel's farewell speech was followed by a standing ovation and more than 5 minutes of applause.
Jetzt ist es an der Zeit, ein neues Kapitel aufzuschlagen.
Now it is time to open a new chapter. Today, at this moment, I am filled with one overwhelming feeling, the feeling of gratitude. It was a great pleasure. It was an honor. Many thanks.
Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, or AKK as she's known, is a Merkel loyalist. But speaking ahead of today's vote, she addressed her Mini Merkel nickname.
Ich habe viel gelesen, was ich bin und wie ich bin.
I have read a lot about what I am and who I am. A mini, a copy, a simple continuation of the status quo. Dear delegates, I stand before you the way I am and how life shaped me, and I'm proud of that.
I asked our Berlin correspondent Damien McGuinness if the Mini Merkel nickname was a fair one.
Well, she is a Merkel ally, so she does have some similarities when it comes to how she operates. So she's very consensus-driven, like Mrs. Merkel. She's good at operating behind the scenes. She's good at striking compromises, so how she operates is very similar to Merkel. But what she believes is actually quite different. She's also something of a centrist, but she's slightly more conservative than Mrs. Merkel. When it comes to social matters, she's more conservative. She's also much tougher on law and order issues, and certainly when it comes to migration and refugees, she's also much tougher. So what she probably can do, Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, would be unite the party more, because a lot of conservatives within the centre-right Christian Democrats are very dissatisfied with how Mrs. Merkel has dragged their party to the centre. They accuse her of betraying conservative values. Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer will be someone who, with her conservative beliefs, but her centrist way of operating, will be able to straddle those two contradictions, really. Will be able to keep conservatives happy, but will also be able to work and operate within this consensus-driven German political system. So it's a real signal of stability for Germany going forward.
And I guess that line of her being more conservative, will that appeal to the CDU, as you're saying, at a time when they've been losing support?
Yeah, it's certainly going to answer a thirst within the CDU to get back to those conservative roots. She's also more popular with the general population than a lot of her rivals were, who were much more conservative than her. So I think what we'll probably see is certain stability in the short term. But of course, this is a fragile governing coalition. So in the medium to long term, this government is not predicted to last very long. Mrs. Merkel has said she wants to stay chancellor until her term ends in 2021. A lot of people feel that's unlikely. With Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, it's more likely than it would have been with her very conservative rival, who was someone that Mrs. Merkel would not have been able to get on with. But the reality is that this is a coalition with a centre-left and a centre-right government who don't really want to be in a government together. And at some point, the odds are that this is going to break down. That's what many people feel over the next couple of years. So even though Mrs. Merkel wants to stay until 2021, what she might end up doing is, with the new party leader, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, they might see if over the next year or two, when the moment is right for them, that they actually orchestrate fresh elections rather than it sort of happen in a big row, which might have been the case with some of the rivals who are going for this party leadership. What we might now see is, rather than Mrs. Merkel staying until 2021, it might be that we have fresh elections slightly early, but at a time that suits Angela Merkel.
Damien McGuinness. As we record this podcast, the chief financial officer of the Chinese tech giant Huawei is in a Canadian courtroom to find out whether she'll be released on bail following her arrest at a Vancouver airport last week. Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of Huawei's founder, was charged with fraud by the Canadian authorities on behalf of the United States. Prosecutors say the case is linked to Huawei's alleged violations of sanctions against Iran. The BBC's Dave Lee is at Meng's court appearance. He told me what's been happening.
So far, what we've heard from the Canadian prosecutor who's acting on behalf of the US Department of Justice, those charges basically paint a picture of a vast conspiracy that Ms. Meng is said to have been in charge of, and that conspiracy was to evade sanctions against Iran. And the way to do that, they said, or the way they alleged that Huawei was doing that, was by creating an unofficial subsidiary named Skycom that Huawei always contested had nothing to do with them, but prosecutors now allege that Skycom essentially was Huawei, and that's how they were getting around these sanctions, by deceiving financial institutions, banks, to carry the money for them.
And what have her defense team said?
The company itself has denied any wrongdoing. They said that the arrest is unreasonable and without merit. The defence team basically was defending not so much against the charges itself, but why she wouldn't perhaps be considered a flight risk. And the lawyers for Ms. Meng said that because her husband is in the country, in Canada, there is no incentive for her to leave. But to be frank, US prosecutors dismissed that quite quickly, and they say that because of her immense financial resources and also the political nature of her arrest, they say that she represents an overwhelming flight risk.
But beyond all the legal wrangling, we are actually talking about what is becoming a very big row between the U.S. and China on the margins of this trade dispute, focusing on Huawei, which has become a big competitor for U.S. Tech firms like Apple. And China would argue that's what this is really all about.
Yes, and China certainly is making that argument already, as is Huawei's public relations team here in the US. They say that, America's looking at Huawei as a major competitor to Apple, and that's not without merit. I mean, Huawei became the second biggest smartphone manufacturer in the world, above Apple, but still behind Samsung. The Chinese side of this debate would like to put forth that as the potential motive. The US says no, that's not the case, and they pointed out in court today there's been an arrest warrant for Ms. Meng since August.
There's a concern also in the U.S. and other Western countries about the possible links between Huawei and the Chinese intelligence services, and the possibility that granting Huawei access would create problems in that regard.
So there is this suggestion that because of the size of the company, because of its links to the Chinese government, that there is the possibility that this equipment, and this is more so about not so much the smartphones and devices that Huawei sells, but the telecoms equipment and infrastructure that the company creates. It's more about concerns about the surveillance possibilities through that equipment.
Dave Lee. The U.S. president has put forward his nomination for Attorney General a month after forcing Jeff Sessions from the post. Donald Trump has named well-known conservative lawyer William Barr, who previously held the post in the 1990s, as his choice. Mr. Barr's job is a crucial one because he'll take charge of the Mueller investigation into allegations of Russia meddling in the 2016 election. There's also been another White House development in what many observers see as a surprise. President Trump has picked his State Department spokeswoman, Heather Nauert, with scant experience in diplomacy, to be America's new UN ambassador.
Heather Nauert, somebody that we know very well, who's done a great job at as working with Mike Pompeo and others over at the State Department. Heather Nauert will be nominated. She's going to work with Nikki Haley to replace Nikki at the United Nations. She'll be ambassador to the United Nations. She's very talented, very smart, very quick, and I think she's going to be respected by all.
For more, I spoke to Gary O'Donoghue in Washington.
In terms of William Barr, the pick for Attorney General, he's obviously done that job before, so he's been round the block in that sense. He's also expressed a few sympathetic words for Donald Trump over the last year or so in terms of the Mueller investigation and other areas, which is why I'm sure you came to Mr. Trump's attention. And, there's a chance he may end up overseeing the Mueller investigation. But don't forget, he has to go through a nomination and confirmation process in front of the US Senate. And while that would look reasonably okay, given the Republicans have a more of a cushion there now, it's not certain. And it could take a while. And Robert Mueller may have all wrapped up by then.
There's been a lot of commentary in the American media, hasn't there, about Heather Nauert's naming, people saying, well, she's a great journalist, perhaps a good spokeswoman, but can she cut it at the UN?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, she doesn't have any direct diplomatic experience. She was a Fox News anchor, which is, again, something that will endear her to the president. She has a very sure hand at the podium when it comes to the State Department. There's no doubt about that. And I think that's what attracted the president about her. She was tipped at some point to potentially be a successor as White House spokeswoman at some point, but that obviously didn't happen. But looks like she's heading to New York. We'll see whether or not she's in the cabinet or not. And if she's not in the cabinet, as Nikki Haley was, that'll send a very clear message to the United Nations. She's not the first journalist to step into a role like that. If you think back to people like the Canadian Foreign Minister, she was a journalist before she went into politics and got a senior role like that.
Gary O'Donoghue. This week, Spain celebrated the 40th anniversary of its constitution, passed as the country became a democracy after the death of the fascist dictator, General Francisco Franco. The country's current socialist government has promised to remove Franco's body from its mausoleum, one of a number of gestures in a country still trying to come to terms with its buried and divided past, as James Reynolds reports from Spain.
Two archaeologists are working at the bottom of this pit. They're dusting around half a dozen skeletons. They put labels next to each set of remains.
This is a bullet and it came across the skull.
A scientist points to the bullet mark in a skull. In San Fernando in southern Spain, a mass grave is being excavated. The bodies here were shot by General Franco's forces during the Civil War in the 1930s. A small group of family members watches the excavation. Yolanda Vega has inherited an 82-year-long family search for her grandfather Domingo, a union worker.
It's
a powerful feeling, she says. My mother died 4 years ago. It was always her dream to find her father's remains. She was only 5 when he died. His death broke the family.
With General Franco, these shots show the days of his success. He had a good run for it while it lasted.
General Francisco Franco won the Civil War and ruled Spain until his death in 1975. He made sure that his family had no need to search for his grave. His tomb at the Valley of the Fallen outside Madrid is half mausoleum, half nuclear bunker.
I just walked through a tunnel in the mountain, more than 100 meters long, and here's the tomb. It's got 4 bouquets of flowers on it, and it just says Francisco Franco, nothing more.
There are several dozen visitors here, most of them posing for photos in front of the monument. It's difficult to know whether or not to call them tourists or pilgrims. They should leave him where he is, this woman says. It's part of the history of Spain. General Franco's 7 grandchildren do not want his body to be reburied. Their lawyer is Luis Felipe Utrera Molina.
They are really worried about this situation. They have very good memories of their grandfather. They love them. Very religious, very friendly, very simple. And they don't want their grandfather to be used for political reasons.
Francisco Franco! The threat of reburial has provoked Franco's followers. They recently demonstrated in Madrid and openly gave the fascist salute.
Esta izquierda está reabriendo las heridas.
This left wing is reopening wounds which had been forgotten. It was 80 years ago. Franco himself has been dead for 43 years. Now they reopened the wounds of people who were peaceful, who could no longer remember Franco. So the Franco supporters have come back.
Y han vuelto.
At the beginning of December, a far-right party called Vox won seats in a regional parliament for the first time since Franco's death. The party's progress worries much of mainstream Spain. At a bar in Madrid, I met Ana Romero Galán, who's written about Spain's recent history.
If you're a bit superstitious, you're kind of disgusted about it, but somehow it's like Franco is back. You know, you're trying to take him away and he's like, I'm here.
For 4 decades, Spain tried to forget its last dictator and his victims. But perhaps the Franco era can only truly finish when the last generation affected by the Civil War is gone. When today's searchers finally join the bodies of their missing grandparents and great-uncles somewhere in the ground of Spain.
James Reynolds reporting. Also in this podcast,
it's a country that is vastly different from the country that expelled Solzhenitsyn in 1974, and yet a country that surely still has a long journey ahead towards being a country that is fully normal.
Why One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by the Russian novelist Alexander Solzhenitsyn has been turned into an opera. The French Interior Minister has warned of a serious security situation in the country as the government braces itself for a 4th weekend of protests. Christophe Castaner said that the Yellow Vest movement, named after the high-vis jackets motorists are required to keep in their cars, had been exploited by extremist groups. Our correspondent Lucy Williamson has been out on the streets of Paris.
The Champs-Élysées is again preparing for battle. Under the Christmas lights, carpenters at makeshift benches fashion bars and barricades for its designer brands. The slogans of last week's protests still visible on some of the walls. The government has said some protesters are coming to Paris tomorrow explicitly to smash and even, it says, to kill. The Interior Minister, Christophe Castaner, said the movement now included both pacifists and those who wanted to topple the state.
I know that those who sympathize with Yellow Vests condemn this violence. I would like to tell them today that everything will be done to defend them. These last couple of weeks have given birth to a monster that is escaping the control of its creators. Today, it's time for us to focus on the Republic and our values.
Almost 90,000 security forces are being deployed across the country. In the capital, armoured vehicles will be used and tourist sites, including the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, will close. The heart of France's political and economic life is becoming a target for those who feel they've lost touch with both. The threat tomorrow may be from extremist groups and violent saboteurs, but the disillusion that originally sparked this movement touches poorer working families across France.
Lucy Williamson. The son of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the greatest chronicler of Stalin's purges, is conducting an opera at the Bolshoi in Moscow based on one of his father's most famous novels, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The book was born from the author's own experiences in the Gulag labor camps. Farhana Dawood reports.
The opera shows life at the camps close up. Prison guards in smart Soviet uniforms patrolled lines of queued men, their heads bowed. The men tried to protect themselves from the cold in dark padded coats and black Cossack hats adorned with large white patches that show each prisoner's identification number. Women work with brooms and metal buckets. Alexander Solzhenitsyn and his family were exiled from the Soviet Union after he exposed the horrors of the country's labour camps to the world. Now his son Ignat, who was raised in the US, has come back to conduct an opera based on the dissidents' work with what he says is a message for modern Russia.
It's a country that is vastly different from the country that expelled Solzhenitsyn in 1974, and yet a country that surely still has a long journey ahead towards being a country that is fully normal, fully integrated.
The Bolshoi Theatre production is one of a number of Moscow events to mark 100 years since the Nobel laureate's birth. City Hall has even produced an app-based Solzhenitsyn tour of the capital. But some accuse President Vladimir Putin's government of repeating the Soviet Union's persecution of artists. Ukrainian filmmaker Oleg Sentsov remains in a Russian Arctic jail on terrorism charges that have been denounced as politically motivated. And the celebrated Russian theatre and film director Kirill Serebrennikov is on trial for embezzlement, a case that many say has been manufactured to crack down on artistic expression.
Farhana Dawood. Now, what does the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban mean when he says he's building an illiberal democracy in Hungary? His domestic critics are worried that he wants to influence all aspects of Hungarian life, and nowhere is that fear felt more than in the arts. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly reports from Budapest.
A spell of silence descends on a huge audience of children packed into Hungary's National Theatre in Budapest. The story unfolding on stage is a knightly tale of quest and courage. John the Valiant. Hungary's rather autocratic ruling party, Fidesz, would find nothing to complain about in this depiction of traditional virtue. The European Union finds plenty to object to in the way Fidesz runs Hungary, like its erosion of judicial independence. But in the arts, there is an upside to its brand of domineering paternalism. The director of the National Theatre, Attila Widniansky, says cultural spending has soared. You won't find anyone in the arts who objects to that, he tells me. And he's excited about a new law which would guarantee children the right to at least one state-funded theatre visit every year. It's one thing to take children to the theatre, of course, quite another to decide what they see once they get there. One thing they won't be seeing, for example, is Billy Elliot, which closed early in its latest run in Budapest after it was denounced for threatening to turn children gay if they saw it. That startling attack came from one of the newspapers taken over by Fidesz supporters and transformed into a government mouthpiece. Balázs Lang saw that process happening at first hand when the independent TV station where he was a senior editor was bought up by government loyalists.
I had to decide whether I would be able to serve propaganda media or I want to remain, an independent journalist, so I had to leave. There are probably 3 or 4 news websites which are actually independent. Free media is shrinking in Hungary. I'm really afraid that it's going to be vanished. I've never thought that we would end up like this, This is shocking.
Maintaining an independent voice in a country where the government has autocratic instincts is not easy. This is slam poetry in Hungarian, and the performer, Peter Molnar, says it's one of the few areas where there's complete freedom of expression here these days. He ought to know. He was a founding member of Fidesz with the Prime Minister Viktor Orban, but he left years ago. And now, you sense, he finds his old friend a little alarming.
Public space which is not controlled by the government directly or indirectly is getting tighter and tighter. What's happening in Hungary, in my view, is not a dictatorship, and Viktor Orban is not a dictator. The government has been seizing control over a growing part of the media system in Hungary. There are still numerous media outlets which are very critical of the government.
We love to boogie. We love to boogie.
So in the arts and in the media, the instinct of Hungary's Viktor Orban is to control and to silence opposing voices. He worries his fellow European leaders, but it's clear they don't really know how to handle a man who, like Erdogan in Turkey or Putin in Russia, acquires democratic legitimacy through the ballot box without having real democratic instincts. Billy Elliot is an unlikely casualty in a battle for the soul of this country. So here to end is a little more of Billy's soundtrack. This won't be heard anytime soon in Viktor Orban's Hungary.
Kevin Connolly reporting. The sport of endurance obstacle course racing may not be a familiar one, but this weekend it could leave a largely unknown British athlete $1 million richer. That's the bounty awaiting John Albon if he wins his third major event of the year in Iceland. But he'll have to cover more than 150 kilometers in 24 hours while negotiating challenges that include carrying sandbags, climbing walls, and crawling under barbed wire. Andy Swiss takes up the story.
He's never had a coach, says he eats what he likes, but John Albon is the world champion at what is the most extreme of extreme sports. Obstacle course racing involves a long-distance run interspersed with grueling challenges. Everything from dragging giant tyres and climbing ropes to jumping through fire. This year, the organisers offered $1 million bonus to anyone who could win all three of their biggest events. And after winning the first two in the United States and Greece, Albon now faces the toughest test of all, a 24-hour so-called ultra race in Iceland. He lives and trains in Bergen in Norway, from where he told me he's trying not to think of what he'd do with the money.
It's a big ask. I'm trying to just imagine going there, maybe running under the Northern Lights, trying to have as much fun as possible, and possibly coming away with $1 million. But if I was to win, I think a cabin in the mountains would be pretty nice, because that would enrich my training and I can go skiing a lot easier.
Albon says his biggest challenge will be the Icelandic weather, which he describes as nasty. This weekend promises sleet showers and temperatures around zero. But if he can overcome the conditions and this arduous challenge, it could be one of sport's most valuable victories.
Valuable, but very difficult. A sport I won't be taking up anytime soon. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. And if you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Emilio San Pedro. Until next time, goodbye.